Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name's Tina Liberatori, and I'm the president of GEM Learning. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you today Betsy Hill. She is an experienced educator and president of the Brainware Learning Company. She has studied the application of neuroscience to teaching and learning with Dr. Patricia Wolf and other experts. She works with educators, clinicians, and corporate trainers using neuroscience research to address some of the most perplexing problems in education, including closing the gap for historically underperforming students. She addressed issues of college and career preparedness as a trustee and board chair at Chicago State University. She holds a Master's of Arts in Teaching and an MBA from Northwestern University, and teaches strategy at Lake Forest Graduate School of Management and the University of Illinois, Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us today, Betsy.
Oh, I'm just delighted to be here, Tina. Thank you so much for having me. And I think we're ready to get going. So hello, everybody. Good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are in the world. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. What we're going to talk about this afternoon are neuromyths, and basically fact and fiction about the brain and why it matters. It's been really interesting. There's been some research recently on not so much on parents, and I think the group today is probably comprised a lot of parents. Maybe we have some teachers with us, but even teachers who are supposed to know a little bit more about teaching and learning believe quite a large proportion of the myths about the brain that exists. And for some neuromyths, it's as much as 90% of teachers that actually believe them. So not only do we have a lack of knowledge in some cases, but in many cases, we also have a firm belief that what we know is true that simply isn't true. And so what we're going to explore this afternoon, most neuromyths have a kernel of truth in them, but have misinterpreted the science. And so we're going to try and clarify some of those things. When we believe the incorrect information, not only do we waste time, we can become pretty frustrated, and we can actually even use some counterproductive strategies. So that's why I think it's so important to sort of share the actual facts of the matter. And I am assuming that everybody knows they can ask questions as they go along. Tina, is that? And we'll sort of save those to the end, but
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to tackle today 5 common neuromyths, and for each of them we'll look at what the kernel of truth is, talk about what's really going on, and why it's important to dispel that myth. The trouble we can get in if we don't. So the first one, and Tina is going to pull up a poll now, so I have the question on my slide, but we're also going to give you a chance to interact and use the wonderful technology on this platform. So Tina's going to bring that first poll up.
Okay, sorry, just take a moment here.
The question is going to be about how much of our brains we use. And your choices are 10%, 100%, 100% when awake, and 20% when we're asleep. And depends on intelligence. Okay, organizer must, those. So.
And the poll is up, and we are getting our answers, and it looks as though, I'll give a couple more seconds here, a couple more people voting. We have 83% at 10%.
Okay. All right. Well, that is great to know, because the correct answer is not 10%. The correct answer is actually 100%. So that's one of those neuromyths that people still believe, but is not actually true. And so we're going to talk about why it is that we probably believe it. So one possible explanation for the idea that we only use 10% of our brain is that when people have done autopsies of brains and whatever, and we know that our brains are made up of little tiny cells called neurons. And this is a big blown up picture. Neurons are very, very tiny cells, and there are about 85 billion of them in our brains. 30,000 of them would fit on the head of a pin. So they're very tiny. So this is obviously just a much blown up diagram of what is sort of like. And so there are neurons, and these are the cells that actually actively communicate. They connect together, they transmit and send and receive messages in our brains. So when people look at brain scans or simply the amount of neurons in the brain, those are the parts that are active. And then there are all these other things in our brain. So there are a lot of other cells, and these purple and blue things are some of the other kinds of cells that exist. They're things that are called glial cells, different types of glial cells, and there's blood vessels and all kinds of other things. So it may be that when you looked at the brain and all of the material and structures and things in it, that people said, well, it's really only about 10% that's active in any given situation. And this is very similar to this group of brain scans that we're seeing. So these are from a type of brain scan called a PET, and it just means that this is one of the kinds of brain scans that allows scientists to look at the activity in a brain while the individual is performing some task. And so what happens is that the areas of the brain that are the most active will be lit up, as we call it, or activated. And so the parts that you see in yellow and red and white have the highest activation. They're the most active. The ones that are green and blue have less activity. And then you can see some black spaces where it looks like nothing is going on. And these involved having people do tasks like listen to words or view words, speak words, and they would look at the parts of the brain that are active. Well, on this scan, it looks like there are parts of the brain that are doing nothing, but that's not actually the case. What the case is that all of our brains, all of the neurons in our brains are constantly on standby, communicating with others. It's these concentrations of structures in the brain that are the most active, and so we can see them. So it's just the difference between being a little bit active and being a lot of bit active is what we're seeing in those lit up. But when people look at the scans, they may tend to assume, oh, well, there's a whole bunch of our brain that we're not using. But in fact, that isn't the case. And then, of course, another reason that one of the reasons that it persists is that it is such a tantalizing idea. This, of course, many of you probably have seen the film Lucy with Morgan Freeman and Scarlett Johansson, where Lucy gets to use eventually 100% of her brain. And it's fascinating and it's fun to think about. But the thing, and we also have an instinctual or intuitive feeling that we can get smarter. In fact, we can. And we can talk more about that later. But it's not because we're going to use more of our brain. It's because we're going to be able to use it more efficiently and get the different parts of our brain working together better. So it's not that we actually can improve our intelligence. We can grow our intelligence. We can train our brains to do things that we probably didn't think that we could actually get them to do. But we're not going to be just using more of our brain. So the reason, why is it so important to dispel this neuromyth? If we believe that we only use 10% of our brain, that means having a very fundamental lack of understanding about how our brains work and how they do that work. So, for example, if we were only using 10% of our brain, we can imagine that we could get an injury to part of our brain that just wouldn't matter very much. It wouldn't have such a devastating impact. But many of you probably have had experiences, maybe yourself, where you've had a concussion or know somebody who's had a traumatic brain injury or a stroke, and know how devastating damage to a particular part of the brain can be. And then you're going to think about, okay, so if it was true that we only use 10% of our brain, how would you actually help your students or your children improve the percentage of their brain that they use, and how would you know? And of course, we have no way to measure that. Also, we start to then have, if we don't dispel this neuromyth, we might continue to believe in things like the impact of brain size and the relationship of brain size to intelligence and to cognitive capacity. And so very often I do an exercise when I'm doing training with teachers or with parents where I have them, and you all can do this. This is the play along part. Put your two fists together. So fold your hands into fists and put them together so your thumbs are right lined up in front of you. And this is about the size of your brain. Your brain weighs about 3 pounds, and it's about the size of your two hands put together. Now, of course, some people have bigger hands than others. And so everybody then looks around the room and says, oh, my hands are bigger or smaller. But the fact is that doesn't really have any relevance to intelligence. What matters about our brains is that they develop and they make lots of connections among all those neurons, among all those cells in the brains. And the number and efficiency of those connections and connections in different parts of our brains are actually much more related to intelligence and cognitive capacity. So we need to forget about this concept of using only 10% of our brain. We use all of our brain, but we also, in different ways, then can exercise our brains, and a lot of the work that GEM Learning does with the various programs that use it is all about that. It's about making our brains operate more efficiently. Okay, so statement number 2, people learn better. We're going to do another poll on this one. People learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. So it might be auditory, visual, or kinesthetic. And this one's easy. You just have to choose true or false.
All right, we have about 15 more seconds on the poll. A couple more coming in. And it looks like we have 86% say true.
Okay. And I'm so glad you're all here at this webinar today, because the answer is false. And there are a lot of reasons why this has become a very popular neuromyth. And one possible explanation for this is that we know that our brain specializes, and there are different parts of our brain that are responsible primarily for different kinds of activities. So for example, the visual part of our brain is in the back of our brain. So when you're seeing a model of the brain here, the front of the brain is on the left, the back of the brain is on the right, the brainstem is at the bottom. And of course, our brains are not all these pretty colors, but they are divided into lobes and other brain structures that have primary responsibility for different kinds of activities. And so we see in the back of our brain, we actually do see in the back of our brain very literally, which is where vision and visual information is processed. The temporal lobe, which is just above our ears, is where we process auditory information. At the very top of our brain is where we process sensory touch information. The smell is in another place. But the fact is that our brains these are not mini brains. They don't operate in isolation. They all have to work together. So while they specialize, they also very much work together. So for example, when you are standing and talking with somebody, you're getting the information from what they're saying, as well as the information from watching them and their body language and those kinds of things. And your brain has to put all those together to make one unified sense of the world. So there are other reasons, which is, we do know that some people have stronger verbal skills than others, or some people have greater auditory skills. And there were people who consultants of various kinds, who developed a myriad of theories about these various types of skills and translated them into styles of learning. And this is more of a complex, not just auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, but these are, you'll find about a zillion of these. If you go and look for learning styles on the internet, you'll find a lot of these. And so people came up with theories and said, well, you know, if somebody likes to get information orally or likes to get information visually, maybe they would do a better job of processing that information if we gave them that information verbally or orally or whatever the case may be. But it turns out, and here we got to take a little bit of a step backward and talk about what learning really is. So when we put our students and our children in a learning situation, and we think about what learning is, at its very core, it's actually a biological process. So learning is actually, we had that little picture of neurons earlier, and think about all those neurons in our brain, 85 billion of them. So what learning is the act of making and strengthening connections between thousands of neurons that form neural networks or maps. So many of you may have heard the term synapse. Synapse is the connection between one neuron and another neuron. And when information flows from one neuron to another neuron through the synapse, those neurons are communicating, and they communicate in large groups to reflect actions we might be taking or ideas or what we're thinking about. And when we remember something, we don't go pull it out of a storage vault. What we actually do is reactivate the neurons that were active during that original learning process. So think back again to that person that you're standing and talking with. Your brain is being activated in the visual part of your brain and in the auditory part of your brain, and you're connecting it to other existing networks. Maybe you're talking about your child's school or the soccer game or the PTA meeting or the grocery store or whatever it might happen to be. And so it's connecting to the neural networks that represent that information. So you're just reactivating all of those to be able to be aware of them. The neuroscientists use a phrase that reflects this, which is called neurons that fire together, wire together. So they don't literally wire together, of course, but what it means is that when a group of neurons is activated at the same time, over and over and over again, it's the tendency for them then to reactivate is going to be much, much stronger, and they will sort of wire together. So when you trigger one, you trigger part of a memory, it's going to all come back up, and then all of those neural connections will be reactivated. So our brains are literally shaped by our experience, and we construct our understanding of the world within our brains. This is a picture of what neurons actually look like in the brain. You can see the little dark cell bodies, and you can see all those many, many, many trillions and trillions of connections among those billions and billions of neurons. So it's all about those neurons connecting. And this is a picture of an adult brain, a very small piece of an adult brain with all these neurons. But you didn't start off with all these connections. So these are a couple of other images which show on the very left-hand side neurons in the brain of a newborn, and on the right-hand side, neurons in the brain of a 2-year-old. And you can see that the newborn has those nice little neurons with some axons and dendrites extending out from them, but they don't have very many connections. And what's going to happen over the next 2 years is that based on the experience that that child goes through, they're going to connect up these neurons. And that's going to be then looking like the picture on the right. So this is truly a picture of learning. This is what happens when we learn things. We form these connections among these neurons in our brains, and then we have them to reactivate when we want to recall that information. So why is dispelling this neuromyth important? Well, it's important because we don't transmit knowledge and understanding to our children. It's important that we don't just set up that auditory channel or that visual channel and present the information, then it gets into our children's brains. Each child's brain has to construct that knowledge from the experiences that they have. And so the experiences that you provide and the teachers provide for our students, for our children, physically change their brains, makes more connections. And as it turns out, the more modalities that we use, so when we use not just visual information, but visual and auditory and kinesthetic and other modalities, the more of those we use. So we don't want to just give preference to one, we want to use a bunch of them. And that is what creates a stronger connection and a more enduring and durable neural network. So, and part of it is, if you think about any memory, you might think of your concept of a dog. So when you think about a dog, you may think about the sound of a dog barking. You may think about what a dog looks like. Maybe you have a dog in your home, and you probably might visualize that breed of dog versus another. You might smell the way the dogs smell when they come in out of the rain. You might have a sensation and a memory in your brain for what their fur feels like when you pet them or when they lick you on the cheek or whatever. So the more ways that we have to access that memory, the easier it's going to be to reactivate it and to remember it. And so when we have those multiple modalities and multiple ways of accessing the information, that's actually going to create the best. And so not just relying on a single method of getting that knowledge in. So you can relax, your teachers can relax. You don't have to try and redo every lesson plan for 3 or 4 or 10 different modes of learning. Everybody's going to benefit from having access to that information in multiple ways. Hole number 3. Okay, so here we're looking at the concept of a left brain and a right brain. And there's been a lot of discussion, of course, about people who are primarily left brain and primarily right brain, and how this can potentially maybe explain differences among learners. So again, this is a true-false question.
I think we have a couple more people voting. We'll give it 1 or 2 more seconds here. And we are at 50-50.
Okay, 50-50. Well, 50% of you are right and 50% of you are not. And the 50% who are correct are those who said false. And okay, so now we have to go and find what's the kernel of truth and what does this mean and why do we not want to believe that. Okay, so a likely explanation, again, there is a kernel of truth here, which is that, as we talked about before, our brains do specialize in different areas, in different kinds of activities. And we do have 2 hemispheres. We have 2 halves of our brains, but they're connected with a very dense set of connective tissue called the corpus callosum, which means that they're constantly communicating back and forth. But as you probably learned in school, movement on the left side of the body is governed by the right half of your brain and vice versa. Production of speech tends to be predominantly in the left hemisphere, although there are some people for whom it is in the other. Creativity and new ideas often emerge on the right side. Language and recognition of faces are on 2 different hemispheres. Reading is largely in the left hemisphere, but recognition of patterns is in the right. So you can read this for yourself. I don't need to read it all. But the idea is that, of course, our brains specialize, but nothing happens in our brains, remember, unless it's happening all across our brains. And they're always communicating. So, for example, if I say, oh, I love you, there's part of your brain that is understanding the literal meaning of the words, and part of your brain that is understanding the intonation and the affect, the emotion that's within that phrase. And it has to put them together for you to truly understand what that is. And so our brains are always working together. But this is the kernel of truth, is that our brains specialize in different areas. And we know this. One of the fascinating stories that are associated with different parts of our brain doing different things come from a young man named Tan. And he was seen by a French surgeon named Paul Broca. And this is a picture of poor Tan's brain after he died. And you can see a big gouge there. And again, this is the front of the brain is on the left and the back of the brain is on the right. So this is the left side of his brain. Well, it turns out that Tan, when he came to see Dr. Broca, obviously understood everything the doctor was saying to him, but he could only produce one word, and that was Tan, and that was why he was called Tan. So, if you asked him to, pick up something and move it, he would do that, but he could not produce speech. Well, it turns out that this, when Dr. Broca discovered this, unfortunately Tan died, and he was able to autopsy his brain. And he looked at the brains of other patients that he'd had with similar difficulty producing speech and found that there was some kind of damage, lesion, or whatever in that part of the brain. And so it was named Broca's area, and we know today that Broca's area is responsible for speech. But that doesn't mean that we preferentially use different parts of our brain, but of course it's became popularized, and people started to say, oh, well, she's a very analytical person, she must be right brain dominant, or he's a very creative person, they must be left brain dominant. And the truth is that we can develop skills, we can develop creativity, we can develop analytical skills, we can develop the ability of our brain to coordinate all these activities, and we can strengthen all of those. So even if we have a stronger area or a weaker area, we can actually improve how they function. And of course, this is a very fanciful idea, and rather than those little individual tiny bridges, there's actually, as I said, that very dense set of fibers between the two hemispheres where they're always communicating. And there's no real advantage. We all have times when we need to be analytical. We all have times when we need to be creative. We can work on doing those things. But when we assume that one predominates and that is the only way that person really can function effectively, we're truly limiting what that person can accomplish. I remember when I was young, my sister told me, she said, well, I'm the creative one and that I was the analytical one. Well, it turns out that I have a lot of creative skills as well. But there were times in my life when I wasn't so sure. And our beliefs about our students and our beliefs about our children have a big impact on their performance, and their beliefs about themselves can limit them. So it does us no good to say you're predominantly a right brain person or predominantly a left brain person. We all have a whole brain, and what we want to do is to develop that. So just like with learning styles, we don't want to adjust teaching. We want to train students and help them develop the competencies and the skills in their brains, both in analytical ways and in creativity ways and in synthetic ways and in imaginative ways and in visual ways and in concrete ways and in touch ways and in all the ways, different ways that our brains work. Okay, now we're ready for number 4. Okay. I love being able to do it this way and hear what everybody's thinking about. So this is about critical periods in childhood, after which certain things cannot be learned. And you have 4 choices here.
Got a couple more votes coming in. I'll give it one more second. And we are at 83% false.
Okay, well, good job. I'm going to say mostly false. And I'm going to say mostly false, but I'm going to give everybody credit for false. That was a really good job, guys. So I have a colleague who's sitting here with me, and he's laughing at me now. Anyway, the truth is that there are some areas that, some kinds of things in our brains that really do have some periods of time during which they need to develop, and after which it's very, very difficult. But the other part of the truth is that there are so many ways that our brains are constantly changing. So good job, everybody, for recognizing that. So here are some possible explanations. We know that you've all read about the first few years are critical. But if you haven't developed a certain skill by the age of 3, you may not be able to develop it. And there are a lot of measures of various kinds of things, your vocabulary, your self-control, IQ. And by the time you're 3, but they measure it when you're 3, those scores are actually very predictive of later success. So you think maybe they don't develop after that, but that is certainly not the case. There are also studies of vision development. So, for example, if you have a child who is born with cataracts, it's not a very common thing, but there are congenital cataracts. Those need to be, they used to defer that because they didn't like to do surgery on very, very young babies. But what they started to realize is that if they didn't operate within those first couple of years, then those children would never have true binocular vision. So again, we want to just remember that our brains develop in interaction with the environment. And so when we are able to interact with the environment, then we go through normal periods of development. So there are some things like this that can be very seriously impaired and maybe, if not absolutely critical time period, pretty close to that. Similarly, you may be aware of studies of hearing where children who are born deaf later are able to get a cochlear implant, which allows their brain to produce electronic signals that then stimulate and communicate with the area of the brain that processes auditory information. And if that is done early, their speech and their ability to process language and other kinds of sounds is virtually normal. But if it's waits too late, then it can be impaired. Language acquisition is another great example. When we are born, we have the capability to learn any of the 6,000 languages in the world and to speak them without an accent and completely fluently. By the time we're about 10, we have lost the ability, or a large part of and there's a lot of personal variation in this too, but you've lost a lot of the ability to actually hear sounds. So, for example, Japanese speakers don't distinguish between the sounds ol and the L sound and the R sound. If they are growing up in an environment where they're also hearing English or another language that does distinguish between those phonemes, they will be able to hear ol and But if they don't, then very often they just don't hear that difference. Now, it is possible to train that hearing later in life, and that's also a fascinating thing. But again, so there are these examples of things that are much easier to do. And some of you may remember from your early psychology 101 class about Conrad Lorenz, who raised, I can't remember what kind of geese it was. It was a particular type of geese, and they the babies hatched and saw him and thought that he was their mother because they imprinted on the first live entity that they encountered. So there are these things that happen very early, but for the most part, what the neuroscientists will tell you is that these are now referred to more accurately as sensitive periods rather than critical periods. So even though there are important periods for some of these things, and it may get a little bit harder to learn, we still can learn throughout life. And this is, think about the fact that what happens when our brains are growing and when they're developing. So when we are, before we're born, during those 9 months in the womb, our neurons are growing. We start, of course, with just a few cells, and then they grow, and they're growing at the rate of 250,000 per minute on average over those 9 months. That's just, that's how we get those 80-some billion of them. When we're born, your brain is going to weigh about a pound, typically on average. By a year, it has doubled. And by age 5 or 6, it's 90% of the size and weight of an adult brain. And of course, I've already told you the answer to this. It's not that we're growing more neurons after we're born, it's that we're growing those connections. So again, we're going to see the brain of that newborn with very few connections, the brain with the 2-year-old with lots and lots of connections. And in fact, that 2-year-old brain has too many connections, and it's going to have to prune away some of the ones that aren't very useful. So this is also a picture on the right of the terrible 2s. So they're, forming these connections, and then we have to get rid of the extra connections, and the ones that remain. It's sort of like if you think about what happens on the bus route in your city that you may live in. The bus routes that get lots and lots of ridership are kept, and then they get rid of the ones that there aren't much ridership on. The same principle, sort of an analogy, good analogy for what happens in the brain. We also know that there's some things that happen in the brain, some development of the brain over time. And I wanted to share this because it really sort of helps to explain sort of the general maturation of the brain, and particularly the development of the brain that is responsible for self-control, planning, decision-making. And we talk about critical periods or sensitive periods. This is a period that actually lasts a very, very long time, well into our 20s or 30s. And so what you're seeing here is different views of the brain, starting at the age of 5 and going on the right to the age of 20. And based on the colors is the amount of gray matter as opposed to white matter. So there's a lot more gray matter on the surface of the brain when we're young. And then as you can see, it starts to get down into less gray matter, which just really means more white matter. And I'll explain that more in just a moment, from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. Now remember that the back of the brain is responsible for vision. So this is brain maturation, and the back of our brain, it gets mature very, very early. We need those visual skills for survival. And then it eventually gets to the front of our brain. Now the front of the brain is responsible for decision-making, planning, self-regulation, complex thinking, problem-solving, all of those things. And so it's interesting to know that our brains don't actually fully mature in the front part of our brain, at least until our mid-20s. And some of the research now is suggesting that it could be even later than that. So if you think about how people become rational, you think about the teenage years and the fact that our brains aren't fully mature, that also talks about the fact that our brains develop in different areas at different rates. However, we still want to think about the importance of this in terms of how we can train our brains and how we can encourage and help our children develop the most brain power, if you will, that they can. So we don't want to overemphasize some of these critical development periods, because we may then say, okay, well, this child is past the developmental stage to learn a language or past the developmental stage to learn something else. But that may not be true. And I myself went through vision therapy when I was young. And while they say that certain parts of vision are not developed after, very young ages, I actually was able to develop binocular vision at the age between ages of 8 and 10, which is pretty late. So we want to keep our minds open to the possibility. Remember that our experience changes our brains. There are sensitive periods, but not critical periods. There are some things that are critical. Remember, I said mostly false. And our brain just can change throughout life to a much greater degree than we have thought, and than most of us realize. So that's why we want to dispel that myth. Don't give up on them, and don't give up on me, and don't give up on yourself, because even as we age, our brains can be changed and developed to a greater degree than we probably have any idea. Okay, the last poll. Learning problems associated with developmental differences in brain function cannot be remediated, although we can help children work around their weaknesses. And again, this is a simple one, just true or false.
All right, we got a couple more people to vote here. Almost there. And we are at 63% false.
63% false. Okay, well, the 63% are right. And in fact, these assumptions are very widespread. And so actually this group did a really good job of picking through the reality on this one. So very, very good job. But there are a lot of misunderstandings of learning problems, of intelligence, of the brain and how it processes information. And one of the ways that I think, one of the occurrences or events or parts of history that I think has had a tremendous impact and why people are so confused about this goes back to this gentleman. His name was Alfred Binet. He was a French psychologist. And many of you have heard that name, Stanford Binet. He worked with, and he developed a test to test the cognitive abilities of children. When it came to the United States, when all of this work came to the United States, it was misinterpreted. And people thought that it became basically what we all know today as an intelligence test. And unfortunately, the reason that Dr. Binet developed this was to identify students who learned a little differently so that they could get different kind of supports within the educational system. Not that it was a scale, not that some were smarter than others, but simply as a way to identify children and give them the proper educational supports. Unfortunately, when it came to this country, it was used to basically measure on a scale that we've come to know as IQ, where some people are smarter and some people are not as smart. And so that really has created some misunderstandings. And the other thing is that the whole notion of an IQ test, and many of you may have heard this, is that if you take an IQ test and then later you take another IQ test, you're going to get very much the same score. And the notion is, okay, then it's a good IQ test because it's actually testing something that is a characteristic of you or of whoever was being tested. But what that implies, and the big false assumption that is involved with that, is that intelligence cannot be changed. And in fact, we know today that intelligence can change. It can be developed. And we also are confused about what intelligence actually means. And it's used in lots of different ways, but much more acceptance today of the fact that it's actually multiple characteristics, multiple skills in the brain, not just one single thing. And so you can't truly measure intelligence or your cognitive development or whatever you want to call it based on one single number. That is just not an accurate, meaningful, or useful reflection of your capability. And so part and parcel of that, and what's happened in schools is that, and you all may be familiar with this if you have a child who has ever been in special education or has had an individualized education plan. The field of special education developed over the years to support children with learning differences and other kinds of limitations. But particularly if you think about this whole concept of IQ and learning disabilities and things like that, it was designed to help those students be more successful in school despite their disabilities. And so the special education world has come up with a variety of ways to help students. One way that they have helped them is through accommodations. So basically to change the way that students are tested or the environment that that they're tested in or in which they have to perform particular activities. So for example, if I have slow processing speed, or I get very anxious when I take tests or something like that, maybe I'll get more time on the test. Or if I'm having difficulty with visual processing, I may get the questions read out loud to me. So those are examples of accommodations. Sometimes in special ed, they will modify the curriculum. So for example, some students may, if there are 25 spelling words this week, maybe Samantha only gets 10 spelling words this week because that's as much as her teacher believes that she can do. And then strategies, and these are very important as well. So strategies may be, if I'm given a set of instructions, I want to write them down. I want to keep a visual reminder of those things because I can't hold all of that information in working memory. So essentially what all of these practices are doing, and they are in many senses very necessary to support children with learning disabilities. But essentially what they're doing is they're working around these cognitive weaknesses. Another reason that they're not really attacking them, they're not trying to get at the root of the problem and actually develop these cognitive skills that are just not as strong for these kids. It's also been challenging because these cognitive processes are the kinds of things like attention, like visual processing, like processing speed or working memory or inhibitory control. These are things that are very difficult to explain to somebody how to do. In fact, you can't really. I can't explain to you how to hold more information in your mind. I can't explain to you how to screen out distracting information. So these are the kinds of skills, although they're necessary and sit underneath everything else we need to do in education, that we're not the kinds of things that are amenable to teachers teaching. So teachers didn't teach them. They would work around them. But what we know today is that it's actually possible and very, very doable to develop these cognitive skills, not to explain them to somebody, but to actually give the brain some cognitive training in order to be able to do that. There was my slide about different types of intelligence. I'm going to skip over that. I might come back to it though. So what I want to do next is I'm going to share with you, and some of you may have had your children working with a program called Brainware Safari, which is one of the programs that GEM Learning is involved with. And I just want to share with you this one piece of research. We've done a number, over 30 studies with different populations, but this one involved students with specific learning disabilities. So it really gets directly at this question of developmental differences and learning abilities. So this is a little bit of a complicated graph, but I really, it makes a very strong point, so I'd want to explain it. These were a group of students with specific learning disabilities. This was Dr. Avson did this research. It was her doctoral dissertation. And what she did is she divided these group of students, these students with SLD, into two groups. One was the control group, and one was the Brainware group. Now you use a control group because they're the ones that don't get the intervention or the pill or whatever it happens to be in a medical study. They just go about life as normal. And so you want to compare them to the group that does do the treatment, in this case Brainware. In a medical study it might be taking a pill, and to see what difference there may be. There was a cognitive test that was given as a pre-test and then given again as a post-test. It's called the Woodcock-Johnson Cognitive Battery. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's a very well-respected cognitive test. And if you perform on this test like a normally developing student, you would score at a proficiency rate of 90%. So you can see that very top line on this graph that says 90. That line would be where you would expect a normally developing student to perform. And so we can now look at the control group and at the study group. The control group are the blue bars, and the brainware group are the green bars. The lighter bar in each case is the results of the pre-test, the average results for these students. And the bar on the right is the average post-test. So you can see, if you look at the cognitive pre-test for these kids, they were scoring a little bit above 60% proficiency. So a pretty big gap between 60 and 90, which, as I said, was normally developing. And that difference is what SLD is, that by definition, these kids have some areas of cognitive weakness. And I'll show you in a minute what some of those were. But this is an overall aggregate of their cognitive ability. And of course, this is exactly what is standing in the way of their making the kind of progress that their normally developing peers are making. And as you can see, between the pre-test and the post-test, there was not very much change for the control group. They were going through their normal schooling. They were getting their standard reading and math interventions that they were entitled to. But that had very little impact on their ability to perform on cognitive tests. The brainware group, on the other hand, performed on average at 89% proficiency on the post-test, where 90 is normally developing. So virtually closing the gap. So these cognitive skills can be, to a large degree, remediated. They can be trained, they can be strengthened, and these children's brains can work much more like their normally developing peers. And then you're going to see in those next bars the impact that this had on reading and in math. And just to summarize that, the improvement, and I forgot a really important part of this. This was over 12 weeks. So the pre-test and the post-test were 12 weeks apart. This was using Brainware Safari 3 to 5 times a week for about 30 to 45 minutes for 12 weeks. And it had this kind of impact on both cognitive and on their academic skills. So 8/10 of a grade equivalent in reading and a full grade equivalent in math in those 12 weeks. Now, Dr. Afson then broke this down into some of the subtest areas of the Woodcock-Johnson, and there's a lot of information here, but if you just focus on the lighter bars and then the darker bars sort of across the board, you can see that verbal working memory was very low for these kids. Short-term memory was very low. Broad attention was very low. So these are kids who had issues with sustaining their attention, who had issues holding on to information in the short term, who had issues hearing information and remembering it. So for example, if you gave them a set of 3 instructions, they would probably only remember 1. But we're getting them very close to, or sometimes even surpassing, the level that's normally developing. So what special education now can do, or supplemental education and programs like GEM, is actually develop and remediate these underlying cognitive skills to give our students a much better chance at learning. And you can probably figure out why dispelling that myth that it cannot be remediated is so important. When we have a growth mindset, we believe that intelligence and talents can be developed, and this is very powerful. If any of you are familiar with the work of Dr. Carol Dweck, she has shown how growth mindset can play a role. Genetics absolutely are important. We can't rule them out. They do play a role, but our experience is critically important. And I just have to think about how different parenting and school and special education and all these programs would be if we really put that belief into practice. If we really said, my child can develop in all of these ways, every child can develop in many different ways to a far greater degree than we appreciate. So hopefully we've done a decent job of dispelling some of those myths and clarifying it and giving you all some perspective on why those myths developed and what is actually the fact and why it's important. And so, Tina, I will stop and see if people have questions, which I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you so much. We actually did have a few questions come in. Our first question is, have you heard of Dr. Porges's polyvagal theory? And if so, do you have any thoughts on it?
I do not know that. How do you spell the name?
It looks like Porges, and the
Gorgeous.
theory is, yes,
And his theory is?
polyvagal, Polyvagal.
No, but I'm going to go look it up right after this webinar and see what I can connect it with. I really can't, if they can provide any more information on what the theory suggests, I might be able to comment on that, but I'm not familiar with that terminology.
We'll see if we can get an email out after the presentation.
Okay, great.
I also have another question here. Can you use classical music to change the brain?
Well, everything we do changes the brain, but there is another neuromyth that is often referred to as the Mozart effect. And this comes from some research where they had kids listen to Mozart, as it turned out, but it actually doesn't really matter. It could have been any classical music. And they performed slightly better on a test that came immediately after that than kids who had not listened to it. And so this gave rise to this idea, oh, we just have our kids listen to classical music and it will organize their brains and they will do better. Well, that has been disproven over and over, very soundly rejected. Now, there is nothing wrong with classical music. I love classical music. I love Mozart. I really enjoy listening to it. The thing that can actually change your brain in a meaningful way and develop cognitive capacity is playing an instrument. And so if your child or you, we can do this as adults as well, learn to play the piano or the violin or whatever, and you learn to play, that does actually correlate with positive changes in the brain and additional cognitive capacity.
Excellent. Had another question came in. Are these programs for high school age children?
So Brainware Safari can be used from ages 6 to 106. So just underscoring again that our brains can change at any level. The program has been used, the most of our research is with elementary and middle school age children, but we will also have done quite a bit of work with older children, including high school, college, workforce, people in their 20s and 30s, people in their 40s and 50s, because the brain can change at any age. And so, for example, we had one school district in Michigan that was using the program, using Brainware Safari with their students, and had success really across the whole range of ages. But a particular story I will never forget, it was a student who was very high performing, so basically getting all A's, but when he took his ACTs, and he got a 30 in everything except for his reading, where he got a 22. And this is a, valedictorian kind of student, and 22 was not what they expected of him. And they said, okay, well, maybe it was a bad day. So they had him go retake it, and he got a 21 on reading the second time. So they decided to give him Brainware and have him do that for 12 weeks. And he went back a third time to take his ACTs, bless his heart. And this time he got a 30 on his reading. So that was a 17-year-old high school senior. So we can have an impact on cognitive skills at virtually any age. It is certainly easier when you're younger, but there's, as I said before, don't give up on them.
Absolutely. We did have one more question here. Does the intervention with Brainware need to be repeated, and how long do the effects last?
That's a great question. So in our research, what we've seen is that the effects are sustained after kids stop using the program. And if you think about it, when you develop these skills, basically what we're doing is we're getting them to the level where they're automatic. So if you can think back to when you were, Tina and I were talking about this just before the webinar started, think back to when you learned how to drive a car. And when you first had to do it, your mind had so much going on, because you had to keep track of the steering wheel and the gas pedal and the brake and the turn signals and where your mirrors were and whether your seatbelt was on and all that kind of stuff. And today you get into your car and you drive to work, and probably most of the time you have no idea how you got there. So you're getting all those skills at that automatic level. And that's what we're doing with these cognitive processes. We're getting them at that automatic level. Well, once they're automatic, you just do them. As long as you're in an environment that continues to put demands on them, which school typically does, they're going to be there. And we do see that in our research, that after we don't have real long longitudinal, so we expect them to be sustained. However, I will also say that for some students, particularly those with some significant learning deficits, very often it can be useful to have them do the program and maybe do it longer or come back and do it a subsequent year. The real truth of the matter is we have no idea to what degree the human brain can be developed. We know that it's far more. That's why we love that 10% myth, but it's not about how much of our brain, it's about how we use it and how agile and how flexible and how, you know, quickly we can process and things like that. So, it certainly is possible that there can be additional benefit by continuing to use the program, but by and large, once you do the program for those 12 weeks, the gains that you get at that time are going to be sustained.
Excellent. I think that covers all of our questions.
Okay. Well, it was been. Oh, go ahead. I just want to say what a pleasure it was to share this with you. It's something I'm very excited and passionate about, and it's great to have some folks who want to listen and join in and ask such great questions.
Well, we appreciate all of you joining in. We hope you'll join us again. And Betsy, we hope you'll join us again. And check back on gemlearning.com on our webinars page to see what's coming next. Thanks so much.
Sounds great. I look forward to it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.